It's a big honor to have Stefan Seifert once more on stage. It's going to be his 23rd talk at adaptTo. This time he will present us another tool from our WCM.io stack, the WCM.io site API.
Thank you. So, welcome to my talk, AEM Headless with WCM.io site API. You know me already. I'm AEM developer, member of the Apache Sling PMC and of the Apache Software Foundation, working with diva-e, the organization of adaptTo. A good part of my talk I will spend with comparing AEM headless approaches, because basically there are two major approaches how you can do headless with AEM applications. And partially it's a bit of matter of taste which you want to use, but partially also depending on your actual project requirements, which is best fit for your problems you want to solve in AEM and your headless infrastructure. So let's compare three pillars. The left pillar is the traditional AEM way of doing things with Sling and AEM components in the back end, rendering all the HTML in the back end, and just delivering the complete HTML to the client with REST interfaces. This is full stack traditional, not headless. If it comes to headless, then in the middle pillar, if you currently look in the AEM documentation, or what Adobe currently proposes most, is the way using headless with content fragments, meaning you are no longer creating pages components in the backend, but you are creating content fragments based on their models, and you consume them via JSON, for example, in your single page application or any other channel, and using GraphQL to access them, to query them. But there's a third way, and this was even older than the GraphQL content fragment way, just using AEM sites, creating pages and components, and using the Sling Models exporter to create your JSON API, not using GraphQL, but just using REST HTTP GET request. And again, for example, with a single page application. Let's look into the details. I will not go in all of them because a lot of capabilities are similar. For example, what you see is what you get editing. You basically do not have. You can have it if you're using content fragments and, for example, using remote SPA or universal editor, as we have seen today. And if you're using AEM sites in the Sling Models exporter, you can have it if you're using the SPA editor. It's optional. You don't have to use it, but you can use it. To have preview of your application with the data before you actually put into production, you can use in the cloud environment the preview publisher, and there you can push your content fragments or your AEM pages and components before actually putting them into production and previewing them with a dedicated instance of your single page application connected with this pre-environment. Front-end deployment, usually you host your front end separately, then you can take favor of using server-side rendering and stuff, which is capable today. You can deploy it using AEM client libs, although it's technology a bit limited and a bit outdated from the build staging, so probably not so recommended today. The last two lines are, my point of view, the most important one, the differences. Speaking of data structure flexibility, of course, you have a lot of flexibility using content fragments with the models you define. But compared to what is possible in JCR structuring, in page and components, it's somewhat limited. I will come later to this later. Whereas if you're using traditional components, you have the full flexibility as you've used it for years in your edit dialogues, and you can nesting and use containers and so on. And there's another drawback using content fragments if it comes to applying business logic for the data you want to output. Because if you use GraphQL to access your content fragments, you more or less get one-to-one the data you are entering in AEM. Of course, there are some tweaks. You can, for example, put in variables to get different resolutions for asset references and so on, or then the media handling. But for the most part of the data, it's one-to-one, what you put in, you get out. So if you need some post-processing, some logic, some cross-cutting concerns, or whatever, it's difficult with content fragments. And it's, of course, possible with AEM sites, because what you export with Sling Models exporter is not directly what is stored in the JSR repository, but you get directly a view of your model. And your model is Java code, and there, of course, you can do whatever you want to pre-process the data, which is then part of your JSON API. Looking at data modeling, if you're using content fragments, first of all, super easy to define your models. You can do it visually, you can export them, the definitions via content packages to other instances, put those definitions in your Git repository to deploy it and so on. It's very easy to use. You can have references to assets, content pages with some special treatment, both in editor and in the API. You can do nested content fragments and references to content fragments as well. And content fragments are in general very well suited for well-structured content. So it's a bit like the discussion in the past, relational database against hierarchical object storage or content repository. So with using content fragments, you're a bit limiting yourself to a sandbox what's possible in the models, and you cannot use the full flexibility you have in the other way. You have a very good edit mode for content fragments, especially in the cloud environment, the latest content fragment console. It's very nice, it's very fast to edit the fragments and very powerful and even extensible. We have a talk about this, how you can do more in this edit environment. And with also a big plus, if you have a team which major consists of front-end developers and is not so experienced in all the niche back-end technology of AEM, they do not know it. They do not need it. So they can just define the models, use the models, and it's not required that they know what is OSGI, what is Sling, what is HDL, and so it's just not required. So very easy for teams which probably are new to AEM. Some contrapoints, drawbacks. There's not really a hierarchy concept in the API accessing content fragments. Of course, you can store your content fragments hierarchical in different asset folders and probably apply different ACLs and so on, but this is not directly reflected when accessing them in the GraphQL. You can do filtering by paths and child pages and so on, but this is more than using a custom logic on the client to apply this. It's also more difficult to really drive a navigation structure out of content fragments because it's basically a pool of content fragments, and it's not so easy to naturally drive a structure as it's possible by just creating hierarchy of pages. And I already said it, you have no business layer for transforming the data, meaning you more or less directly transport your raw data. Why is this a problem? Of course, you can just put all logic in the client, which needs post-processing like calculating something together or validating it. But if you have multiple clients, for example, a single page application, a native mobile app, and probably a screens application or whatever, then you have to duplicate this logic in all your end applications. Whereas it would be nicer to just make sure that your API already publishes this enhanced, enriched data, and not only the raw data which is entered directly. Also a drawback, it's more difficult to model something in content fragments like a container concept, like you're using in pages and components all the way, just creating container, which arbitrary mix of teaser, custom components, text, and so on. It's possible to model, but it's difficult to have the same flexibility. And you cannot use context-aware configuration easily in this context. Looking at AEM sites, you have some pros. You can, if you have, for example, a big customer with a lot of worldwide tenants and sites deployed, you can create a hierarchy of regions, countries, and sites, and you can use a page hierarchy to drive your site navigation, which can only be also be reflected in the API. You can, of course, use context-aware configuration with all its possibilities for inheritance and stuff. You have a lot of customizability, as you will. It's well known in your templates, components, edit dialogues. You can use containers to provide any mix of components in your pages. And from my point of view, especially important, you're using Sling Models to really form your API, which is output. And you can put in any logic you desire, any validation, cross-cutting concerns, link, media validation, whatever, to publish your data. Contra, of course, if you do this, you need to define edited looks and you need to define Sling models for each component you define. This is a bit extra effort and requires, of course, a bit of backend knowledge to do this. Out of the box, there is no generic edit mode. So if you do not implement a front end at all in AEM, in a pure headless mode, you do not have a visual representation of your components out of the box. And out of the box, if you're using the approach which is just from the archetype or in the weekend example, you always have a mixture of navigation and content in your Sling model exporter JSON. And this leads to a lot of redundancy because in every page request, you get the full header, footer, navigation, and also the content. Whereas it would be nicer to split this up because a single page application normally only needs to request the navigation once and then the content for each page. And out of the box, it's not so easy possible to export context-aware configuration or any other metadata which is outside the Sling models generated JSON. For all these 3 points, we have something prepared in our site API to make this easier. So it's not really a drawback if you're using this tooling. Looking at the architecture, how you access your headless data in AEM, GraphQL is cool. It's a standardized query language. There's a lot of tooling and documentation available. It's very powerful what you can do with it. And Adobe enhanced it by providing a set of parameters and so on, where you can affect the rendering of images and asset references. So there's a lot of power in it. Yeah, you can query and filter the data. You can fetch a bunch of resources with one request and deliver them together. And, which is very nice, that AEM provides an auto-generated GraphQL schema. And this is in the base for the query. Contra, in pure GraphQL, it's difficult to cache the responses. If you have very complex queries, they may exceed the GET request size limit. And then you have to switch to post request. This is a limitation of the HTTP specification. And post request, of course, cannot be cached very well. And if you allow free access to your GraphQL endpoints on public published servers, then of course this may be misused by people outside there, and this may lead to performance problems if they can fire any complex queries which just tear the publishers down. Of course, for both, there's a solution. Using persisted queries in AEM, you can make everything cacheable, however complex the response is, and B, you can, in the same case, limit the access to your GraphQL endpoint, not allowing any query, but only the queries you publish. But on the other hand, this also limits the flexibility of GraphQL because the promise of GraphQL was that whatever the clients might need in the future from your data, they just can query it. But using only pre-configured queries, there's more round trips involved to adding new queries for new use cases and so on. So, yeah, I'm not really convinced this is the best solution for querying market-like data, which is, at least in our projects, often used. REST API architecture, I don't have to tell you what REST is. It's just a natural API approach in context of AEM and Sling, because, of course, those was built around REST. So it's very natural to using this here. It's normally fully cacheable if you do not put in personalized stuff or so. And it's a very good fit with the overall AEM and dispatcher caching infrastructure. And we usually propose to provide APIs this way, which are fully crawlable via hypermedia links, which is easy to achieve. Contra is, of course, you do not have this possibility to query or filter site content, and you do not have any auto-generated schema for the API, which is definitely a drawback. You have to do it manually, because it's nice to have a schema for validation and client purposes. Yeah, so our choice, of course, your mileage may vary, but our choice for projects we involved AEM Headless was, yeah, we will stick with AEM sites because this REST architecture was the best fit for use cases for just publishing marketing data to consume it in single page application in combination with commerce and all the other stuff, but all this integration takes place on the client. And we did not really see a big need to query and filter the marketing data, because if we render a view in our single page application, homepage, for example, we need all components anyways, which are stored in this one page. So one JSON which returns all components of this page in the correct order is all we need. And if we need more views, we can create separate pages and so on. So this model with pages and serializing them to JSON fits very well from our point of view. And yeah, we have, of course, a full content structure, flexibility, and customizability. We are known to in all the years what we can do in AEM and with edit dialogs. We can use Sling Models, and we can use hierarchical storage and context-aware configuration with all the possibilities. Yeah, with this introduction, let's come what we have built with WCMO Site API to make it easier. So first, it's really built around headless with AEM sites. So if you are using content fragments, it's nice as well, but Site API will not help you there. What we make easier to really provide a fully hypermedia crawlable API based on what Sling Model Exporter exports and building a bit around it. We usually try to separate JSON endpoints or just views by concern, meaning we have one endpoint for content, one for navigation or header footer stuff, one for configuration, one for sitemap probably, and so on. And separating this so each can be separately requested and separately cached. Optional, Site API is a collection of multiple bundles and Java modules. We provide support for helping with the Open API validation, a generic edit mode helper, so you have a visual representation to have the possibility to make it easier to have unified link media handling in your JSON API, and optionally doing versioning of your API on the API level. Yeah, for this, we introduced a dedicated URL concept, which is configurable, because we are using more endpoints than just the model JSON. We are still very close to the model JSON and reusing it as well, but we want to support those different views. So based on Sling semantics, this is our URL concept. It, of course, URL always starts with a content path. You can shorten it, but usually it's not helpful because the API is consumed by machines, not by humans, so you can now just use a full path. Then we have a fixed selector and extension. By default, it's named site.api. You can rename it to anything else via OSGI configuration. And we use a Sling suffix at the end to map to different processors. This can be built-in one processors we provide automatically, or your custom ones. And optionally within the URL concept, we also support versioning in the URL. Because this fits very well in the dispatcher caching scheme and not using HTTP headers also. Yeah. Processors. Here's an example. So usually we are starting with an index processor, which just lists all entry points to your hypermedia crawlable API. And the most important then is, of course, the content processor. And the content processor is normally one-to-one the export of model JSON. But just renamed. Internally, we just forward to what model JSON exports. Then we have additional processors. Some of them we have pre-built ones, which you can just use. Some often you also implement your custom ones. It's by implementing your own OSGI services, you can add any processor you want with some dedicated logic which just generates the JSON you want from any data in the repository or where you have it. One example, as I said, we always try to achieve that all links and all asset references which you have in your JSON API at any point in the content, in the navigation JSON, in the context-aware configuration should use the same representation in JSON. So it's easier for the consumer application to use generic code which can handle with any link, with any asset, and it's always should be represented the same. And this here is only an example. It's not hard-coded, so in your project you can just decide yourself how your link and asset markup in JSON should look like, and this is only an example used here. Let's look at the demo. We have a demo application which is a fork of the Adobe Weekend example. Sources are on GitHub, and just to give you a short impression how this looks like. So I've increased the size a bit. So we still have a visual UI here because the Weekend demo, of course, comes with a UI, but normally you would not have this if you have a pure headless application, but we still have it here because it was already there. So let's look at the index endpoint. So I will just use this URL structure, site API index.json, and this is a starting point. Normally, the only URL you need to configure in your client application is the index, and from this point, you can crawl to everything you need. For example, to the content, which is one-to-one what the Sling model export, models.json exports. Of course, you have control what's in there. If you implement your own models for custom components, you have full control. Otherwise, you have the JSON which is exported by the core components, for example. In this case, we stripped away the navigation fragments. Usually, we recommend to implement a custom processor for your navigation header footer stuff. In this case, we just filtered the model JSON with only content here and having all the navigation stuff, which you need to request only once when your application loads, separately here with experience fragment footer and header. And if you scroll down here a bit, for example, to the navigation, you will see the navigation items, and they link, and they do not link to the HTML view, which would be by default the case, but they are rewritten and link to really the content JSON processor view of the other content pages, for example, the Megasend page in this case, because this is a URL which is required by the client to hypermedia crawl to the next content page if this is clicked and should be displayed by the single page application. And the last one is an example for config, also a built-in processor which serializes all context-aware configuration, or not all. You can configure, of course, which of your CA configs should be exported and which not. And the serialization happens automatically, which is a non-trivial task because CA configs can be quite complex with nesting and lists of configuration and so on, and all this is taken care of and automatically transformed to JSON. And again, you can modify and control how links and media references are represented here. And in this case, I have an example using WCMO media handler where you provide different renditions for different aspect ratios for one single image. So the editor only configures one raw image, and in the definition is defined that we want 3 aspect ratios, for example, 1:1 and 6:9 and a wider one. And for each you get the ratio, the maximum resolution available in the raw image, and an URI template, which you can use to enter any width you want to use in your client for the breakpoints and the different viewports you want to provide. Okay, let's come back. Speaking of validation, in our projects, we manually defined open API specification for the JSON API, for the JSON output we generate with our Sling models and we generate with our custom processors, for example. And this is easy to do, but of course, it would be nice that it would be generated automatically, but this is not so easy to do. So we did it manually, and we implemented some generic integration test, which is running as custom functional test in a cloud manager, which starts at the index JSON of our sample content, which we deploy for testing purposes as well, and crawl through all pages of your whole sample content in page. And each page is validated against, is it valid JSON, and is it valid against the specification? And this is a very good safety net, because if, for example, we forget to add a new property in the specification or do some refactoring and accidentally breaking our API, this immediately gets visible in the pipeline, and then the build fails, and it prevents us from pushing this change to production. Yeah, and then speaking of the generic edit mode, so as I've told, out of the box, of course, you have to provide your edit dialog and your Sling model. This you have to implement for each component. But you do not have to implement a HTML script which somehow visualizes for the editor which data was added. And here we have a library which automatically can you provide for generic edit view for each component. Maybe core components, but most cases will be probably custom components. And by providing a generic HTML script, which just can be included as a one-liner for each component, it auto-detects all properties from the Sling models, including detecting what is hidden and so on, and detects the type of these data. Is it an image? Is it a link? Is it rich text or simple properties? And provides a simple view. And you can mix this with custom HTML views. We see this in demos soon. And normally, of course, you will use this view as primary view. In my demo, I've used this as secondary view because we already had this primary view implemented for the weekend demo. But to keep this in the demo, but let's look at it. So going back to the homepage. So in this case, as we use this as secondary view, we've just added here extra menu point in the page menu to open this. And this is a normal editor view in AEM with edit modes. So you still have the possibilities, or you still use the normal edit dialog and all the stuff which your custom components or core components comes with. But if you do not care to provide a specific HTML script for each component, you get a view like this auto-generated. And this works very well for all types of components. And it tries to format it a bit nicely, depending here on screen size. Here's a list with all simple properties. It detects images and renders them nicely. It detects links, when it detects nested components and all specialized stuff. And of course, you can mix this. For example, if you have a title or text component, this is so simple that the default rendering of the core component is enough for the generic view. So just use it. And also, for example, here for the carousel, that's a very basic default implementation. We can reuse this as well to switch between the slides and so on. But for all other components, usually it's too tedious to implement a generic dedicated HTML view for each component. So you can use this generic script and get a default view automatically for all types of components. Exactly. This is wrong here. Yeah, what is my conclusion? First, looking at Site API. So Site API is highly customizable. It's, as I said, a collection of bundles and libraries. You can use it with all the other WCML stuff like handler or without it. For example, the context-aware configuration processor can also be used standalone. So if this is the only piece you want to use in your project, it's fine, and use everything else from default. But if you want to go forward with your link and media handling, you know this is my favorite theme. A lot of my 23 talks. Thanks for counting them. So in this case, it's best used with Link Media Handler and our wrapper for core components. If you want to try it out, either look at our weekend demo or use our WCMO archetype, which has some options where you can create it on the fly, including an example Site API and generic edit mode, using it as a starting point or just showing how this works together and how you could apply this to your project. Yeah, and my conclusion is, of course, really take an educated decision about the architecture approach in AEM. For a lot of teams, content fragments is probably the best solutions, especially, as I said, if you have not a lot of AEM knowledge in your team, and if those limitations are fine for you, then go ahead. It's the easiest to use. But if you need more, if you have a very complex customer environment with lots of special custom components, integrations, and stuff, and you want really to make a perfect as possible JSON representation and an API which is as fail-safe as possible to consume for the client, so you can do everything what you can do in the backend, then I think you have more flexibility using sites, AEM sites and the Sling Models exporter. And in this case, Site API is your friend because you can fill in the missing pieces which you otherwise have to fill yourself to have a full working API. Yeah, I've put together some references which you then find in the slides to download. And with this, I'm here for your questions, answers, if you have any.
And we did get some questions, Stefan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So question number 1, can we expose content fragments via the site API?
Not built in. Well, yes, you can do it, of course, if you use the core components, which have the possibility to include single or a list of content fragments. With this, you can expose it, but not directly. But this is probably the best way. Yeah.
Also question, how is versioning is maintained for site API?
Yeah, this is currently not built in automatically. We built it into the UL concept, but the implementation currently was in a customer project, but it works quite simple. Our approach is that our Sling models always implement the latest version. So we start with version 1, and if we do a breaking change, then our Sling models represent version 2. In the same, we implemented a special servlet, which just does which accepts all requests to version 1, and it does a JSON translation from the old API to the new API. So the only precondition is that the new API contains all information from the old API, but probably in a completely different JSON structure. And with this, it was very easy to provide versioning and keeping backward compatibility, so still providing the old version on one JSON, but do not having to worry about the latest, about this version difference in our actual Sling Models code, for example, and unit tests and so on. If there's interest in having this also in WCMO project, maybe we'll write this later, a generic version of it, but currently this is only our approach. Yeah.
Vugar would like to know, how difficult is it to extend the site API by a new selector to expose content which is not covered by the out-of-the-box selectors, and make sure this content is excluded from the existing selector, e.g. navigation?
Yeah, so in preparation of this weekend demo, we added a new default processor, which is based on model JSON, but you can specify include and exclude paths. So it's very easy to use this JSON and exclude, for example, all the header footer stuff. But keep in mind, it's still rendered. So it's not super efficient. It would be better to really replace the built-in language navigation components, for example, by just a custom processor. And besides this, it's also very easy implementing your own processors. It's just an OSGI service, which automatically by default serializes any POJOs to JSON, or you can use a low-level processor, which is anything doing with just writing the response, the JSON you want.
Somebody would like to know, does the generic view support XF references?
Yeah, you've seen in the demo probably, by default, we show them collapsed. And you can just click on it to expand them, because, for example, weekend demo, you have a very long list of listing all the navigation stuff, which is not really interesting in the edit mode. So yes, we have expandable representation, and in it, it has a generic view of the experience fragments.
So we do like one final. I'm sure Stefan will answer the other ones in the chat. What's your take on Adobe's SPA editor approach?
First of all, it can, of course, be very good combined with what I've showed you today. For example, we had a problem in the program that there was always a bit of a lag problem. So we had a front-end team, a big front-end team, and a big back-end team, and new features in the front-end teams were implemented, but they have to make sure that they also work in the back-end. And the front-end team was not so keen on doing, so it's not really difficult making sure it's working in AEM. So our goal was also to use this as side-by-side mechanism adjacent to the SPA editor, having the possibility to always switch back to the generic mode if the SPA editor is not working for some reason. In general, SPA editor is nice, but in our project it was always a bit difficult to make sure the front-end team is also happy with it. So we have seen cases where the SPA editor was not so well received after all. Yeah. But personally, I like it. Yeah.
Thank you, Stefan.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.